Hello, everyone, and welcome back to season 5 of the Digital Adoption Show. We are thrilled to have you with us for another insightful episode. If you haven't caught our previous conversations, be sure to check them out. We've been diving into some thought provoking topics this season. I'm your host, Sanskriti, Digital Adoption Strategist at Whatfix, and I can't wait to explore today's discussion with you. Before we jump in, don't forget to subscribe to the Digital Adoption Show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. That way, you'll never miss out on our latest episodes. Today, we're diving into a topic that's essential for anyone involved in learning, development, or digital transformation: scenario based learning versus simulation, the best use cases in software training. And to help us unpack this, I am honored to introduce our guest, Christy Tucker. Christy is a learning experience design consultant with over 20 years of experience helping people learn more effectively. She's an expert in scenario based learning, known for creating engaging e learning experiences that don't just tick boxes, but genuinely enhance job performance. Christy has worked with a wide range of clients from Fortune 500 companies to nonprofit organizations, and she's been sharing her insights on instructional design and e learning through her blog for over 15 years. She's also a regular speaker at industry conferences, where she has inspired countless professionals with her innovative approaches to learning design. Christy, we are absolutely delighted to have you on the Digital Adoption Show. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, Christy, likewise. Before we dive into today's topic, let's warm up with a quick game of this or that. It's a fun way to get to know you beyond the world of learning design. Are you ready for that?
All right, let's go.
Great. Number one, books or podcasts?
Books,
Perfect. Sticky notes on the wall or mind mapping apps?
mind mapping apps,
Interesting choice. Long form articles or quick micro learning guides?
long form articles.
Great. Microsoft PowerPoint hacks or Excel shortcuts?
I love shortcut.
Me too. Learning from real life case studies or fictional storytelling scenarios?
Gotta go with storytelling.
Great way to engage the audience as well. That was fun, and we got to know a lot more about your interests. And now that we are warmed up, let's dive into the heart of today's conversation. So, Christy, why don't you start by sharing your story with us? Where did it all begin, and how is it going today? And we'd love to learn from you, understand your insights, and then forward.
So, my career has always been about helping people learn in one way or another. I started out teaching K-12 music and band. So, I taught from kindergartners, 5-year-olds, through high schoolers, 18-year-olds. And I have taught everything in between. I taught middle school for several years and realized that there are people who have that gift for working with the middle school age, and I am not one of the people with those but it's a hard age. And so I switched to doing software training, and teaching adults is a lot easier than teaching 14-year-old girls because 14-year-old girls are mean. But I did stand-up classroom software training back in the days when the companies like State Farm and Caterpillar and Growmark would all have a classroom on site with a computer lab, and I would come in and teach. I did a lot of teaching Microsoft Office, so I taught Excel and PowerPoint, project and beginning of relational database design with Microsoft Access, did all of that kind of stuff, a few more specialized things too. But that was what I did for my entrance into workplace training, was software training. And then when the office I was working out of closed and I had to figure out what I was doing, I realized I missed the creation side of things, and I didn't want to be standing up on the stage as much as I had been as a trainer. So I got into instructional design, worked for an online university. I've bounced back and forth in my career between higher ed and corporate training. These days, most of my work is in workplace training online and specifically focused on scenario-based learning and branching scenarios and working with organizations who want to do more with their online learning than just the basic click next and a quiz.
Lovely, lovely introduction, Christy. And it's amazing to hear that you've always been in the learning space, starting from music to now workplace training. Great, and looking forward to our conversation today. So, moving on to the other topics that we wanted to discuss today, Christy, I know that you've been a strong advocate for scenario based learning. Can you walk our listeners through what it is and what makes it such an effective approach to learning, especially when we compare it to the traditional learning methods?
I think a lot of our current training methods often suffer from not having enough opportunities to practice the skills and to get
Mhm.
feedback. Because one of the things that we know works for almost every skill and audience is that you need practice with feedback. Sometimes there are things where it really is simple and all you need is information. Maybe it is the use this field rather than that field to report your time. Okay, that's probably just information and also making the form labels clear enough that you can figure it out, right? That's environment and information. You probably don't need to practice that skill and get feedback on it. But most of the work, so much of the work that we do requires more judgment and requires more practice. It is not a thing that just doing it once is going to be enough. We don't have enough practice. We don't have enough repeated practice. And so scenarios are one way to get in some of that practice. Anytime we can have people practicing making the decisions like what they'd have to make on the job, anytime we can make that practice look more like their real work environment so that it's more likely to be able to transfer, the closer your practice is to what you really have to do, the easier it is to actually then apply it in your job. And so I think that's one of the things that really attracts me to doing scenario-based learning is doing that practice. The other piece of it is providing relevant context. Sometimes we can do training that we try to do everything to every audience for every audience and every purpose, and it gets too generic. And often what we need is this advice, but specialized and applied to this context. And scenarios helps do that as well.
Lovely. Oh, I completely agree to that. In fact, this is such an innovative concept that we are delving into the scenario based learning because that gives an insight into what you are stepping into. And of course, when we have targeted approach to segmented users, not a generic approach, VI learning training, that's also something that would help them in the longer run. Moving on, Christy, software training is often process driven and technical. How do you feel scenario based training makes it more engaging and effective beyond just teaching users to click through steps?
So I think that when I was doing that stand-up class or software training, especially for most of the software training that we were doing, we had some sort of scenario that we were working on of the context of why are you doing this thing? So if it is you're making an org chart in PowerPoint, so yes, you're going to learn how to do shapes and connectors and things, but there's a reason that you're doing that. And it gives you a why behind it and it gives you that context. Because it's very easy with software training to just have the features of the software isolated from how and why you would use it. Very easy to do software training and just go through the menu. Here's the file menu and every choice in that file menu. Here's the edit menu and every choice. But in real life, I don't go through and click everything in the file menu. I start out with a new document and then I type it and then I have to do my formatting and then I'm going to save it and I'm going to publish it at the end. And it doesn't follow the process of how we actually do it. So you set that context and you can have a little bit of the reasons for doing things, right? You do the org chart and then something happens in the organization and things get moved around and now you have to change your org chart. So that's the little bit of a story for PowerPoint training, but now you have a reason for it. Or you need to analyze this data and you've got this great big thing, but that you can't analyze it the way you normally do. So let's show you how to do a pivot table because you can analyze data in a different way. Obviously, I'm doing simple software and we've got more complex software, but the concept's the same. There's often that question of why are you doing a certain thing? It doesn't necessarily need to be a long story, but just enough to give you that why.
Got it. Got it, Christy. And as you mentioned that nobody would go over those particular menus to look for information. So it becomes very important for us to understand when does scenario-based learning works best in software training and what are the situations where it might not be the ideal approach.
So I think that I will say in software training, often what we do need is the procedure with maybe just the barest amount of a story to provide context. If you are in the middle of trying to do something and you're stuck in your software and you needed the solution of how to do this one little piece, you do not want to go through 3 minutes of a story before you get your solution. You want to have the solution. You want to have how do I fix this thing? How do I move on? And how do I get back to work? If we think actually about the 5 moments of need framework, it's an idea of that there's 5 moments of need of when you have training. There is new, when you're learning something new. That's a good point for having a broader training, more comprehensive, and probably for scenarios to provide the context. When you're doing something more, you're trying to level up your skills. Again, that's something where maybe the scenario is part of it. Apply is when you're on the job in the flow of work trying to do it. When it's apply, the most useful thing is to not interrupt your work very much. So it's the stuff that's built into the software or the tool tips, or the faster you can get it into the flow of work, the better off it is. When you need to solve because you've got a problem and you need some bit of training in order to get unstuck from your problem, that again is often something quick, right? We don't want to go to, right? We want to solve the problem. We want to get back to work and then change the other of the moments of need where we have if something's big and changing, right? If we're changing out to new software or the software has completely changed and we need to know what the new things are, you might need a scenario to show here's you used to do it this way, but now we have to do it this other way. I find that scenarios are also really helpful when it's not just a procedural piece of software training, but the how you think about it. So if we look at software like Photoshop, there's a bunch of different ways to accomplish different effects in Photoshop. There's different ways to do things. But you need to know which tool to use when, and you need to have some of that thought process behind it. A scenario might give you some of that thought process of what are you trying to accomplish, and do you need to have a non destructive change here where you should use a mask or something else? I did scenarios for showing a troubleshooting process in something where training instructors use an LMS. Most of it was pretty procedural, right? It was the little videos, the little slick through scenarios, the little simulations to show here's how to do the basic stuff. But we also needed a bigger training on how to troubleshoot if the gradebook isn't adding up the way it's supposed to. And there needed to be multiple different places for them to check, and they needed to have the thought process. We had a character who was thinking through it and showing the thought process of if it's not working here, where else can I go? I could check this thing. What if I did it this way? And so that was a useful place to put a scenario where the I just need to get in and enter my grades real fast probably doesn't need to be the scenario. It is get in, get out, get your job done.
Definitely. Definitely. In fact, talking about scenarios and the right way and the right time to utilize them, do you feel that complex branching scenarios always lead to better learning outcomes? Or can a single crafted decision point be just as impactful in driving skill development?
I think it really depends on what your skill is that you're doing. Certainly, complex branching scenarios are not the right solution for everything. They are a tool that you should have in your toolkit, but you should not be doing them all the time. And for all that I talk about branching scenarios a lot, in practice, a lot of what I build for clients is one question mini scenarios because there's a lot of use for one question mini scenarios. They're very easy to build. They get you that one decision point. They get that focused piece of it. And I might intersperse 3 or 4 different one question mini scenarios throughout a training, or we string together several of them because what I actually want is to show them 4 different kinds of problems. And so I'm better off showing 4 1 or 2 question scenarios rather than one enormous scenario that goes in deep but only shows one aspect. So I think it depends on what's your objective and what's your goal. If we're trying to teach a skill that has lots of different interdependent choices, then we're looking at a more complex branching scenario. If it's really, there's a couple of key decisions that we need them to make, you can go something shorter. And I think in many situations, having a series of a couple shorter scenarios can be just as effective or more effective. Maybe it's just as effective, but it's easier to manage and it's easier to update and to develop. And so there's a lot to be said for the shorter scenarios too.
Definitely, Christy. And I think that this approach would speak to a lot of other people as well. Breaking information into bite sized pieces and creating scenarios out of those is something that everybody would resonate with. Now, when we talk about designing branching scenarios, how do you decide which decision points or metrics are crucial enough to impact learning outcomes? Can you share a certain framework or process that you rely on?
For me, the process starts with how you talk to the stakeholders and the SMEs at the very beginning of the process. When you're doing your analysis and you're talking to them, we often in our conversations focus on how to do things right. What's the desired behavior? What does it look like when it goes perfectly? But in branding scenarios, we need to know what happens when things go wrong. Where are the mistakes? Where do people get stuck? So if your analysis includes questions about where are the mistakes? Where do people get stuck? What are the things that the help desk gets the most complaints about? Where are the problem spots? What are the places where the software has changed recently, where the workflow has changed and people are likely to get confused? Those sorts of things are more likely to need focus in a scenario. That they might be more likely to benefit from a branching scenario. I think in general with branching scenarios, I look at the things that have some gray area to them. There's a right answer and a wrong answer and some okay answers, or something that's maybe partially correct, or it might be right in some circumstances. There's less gray area when we're talking about software training because there does tend to be a correct procedure, but there can be certainly different choices, or there can be different ways to do things. Or if we're talking about project management software, you talk about the variables differently, right? You can solve a problem by adding more resources on it, or you can solve it by stretching out the timeline. And both of those are potentially the right decision depending on what the circumstances are. Those are good for branching scenarios. The things that will cascade and affect other decisions later, those are good decision points. The things where people consistently get tripped up are good decision points. If you've got a procedure with 7 steps and there are 3 specific spots where people have trouble and they can do the other 4 steps just fine, linear skip through, cut scene, whatever to show the 4 that people get all the time and focus on those 2 or 3 where people get stuck.
Got it. Very insightful, Christy. Now, how do you feel scenario based learning and simulation training, since that is also the new normal, are taking as competing approaches, or do they complement each other in software training? Can you share certain examples of how they might work together effectively, and how would it impact the users who might be using these two approaches?
I don't think they're competing. I think it's definitely a question of having multiple approaches. It's the having multiple tools so that you have different options depending on what it is that you need. Kathy Moore in her work talks about figuring out the activity for each objective or each part of the training that you're doing, rather than looking at the activities of we're going to do the whole training in this one way. Really, learners benefit from seeing things multiple different ways and from practicing things different ways. So you might even have something where you actually practice it in multiple different ways. Again, we're back to that idea of we hardly ever have enough practice in training in order to really learn things well. So I think it depends on what we're doing. If it is the kind of skill where people do it infrequently and they can go look it up when they actually need it, honestly, let's do a quick screencast video and let them or and documentation and make sure that it's easy to find and easy to access in their flow of work. We don't need to overcomplicate it. The faster we get people in to solve the problem and get back to their work, the better off they are. And if it's the tasks that they only do once a year, do they actually have to memorize that? Or is the skill that they really need knowing how to find the help? I think that's certainly part of it. You might have to do some simulation training at the beginning of that to make sure that they're very comfortable using the help documentation. I've built training that way for something where wasn't software training, it was something of learning a bunch of principles and guidelines and regulations for something. And I said, do they need to memorize all this? No, they need to generally be aware of it, and then they need to know where to go look it up. Okay, cool. Then the practice exercises are going to be you're working on this, you're trying to figure out your policy. Does your policy match what the regulations are? Now, does this match? Go look it up on the website, and here's the simulation of looking it up on the website to go find it, or find it in the database to go look it up. So we did simulations of looking up the information because that was actually the skill they needed, not memorize the 37 different parts of the regulation, which they weren't going to remember.
And then,
Yeah.
yeah, and I completely agree that identifying the key challenges and the key points where the users would actually utilize that information is pretty important. And effectively combining both scenario based training and simulation training to that matter is quite important as well. Now, we've talked about training, we've talked about how both these approaches complement each other, but measuring the success is also important. And how do you measure the success of scenario based learning programs, particularly in the software training space?
So I think that the confession here is that I'm an external consultant, and the reality is that often it is that I am in that position where I deliver the training and I don't always get to see the results of things. And that is the reality of the work that I do that I'm not always seeing. And I see it sometimes because I have clients who hire me back for repeat work and then we see things. I will see in software training in particular, what you're really looking for is the performance. So you can certainly measure the performance of can they do the skill. And that might be that you do that. I think a simulation assessment is always going to be more accurate than any sort of multiple choice assessment. It it just is it's so hard to measure software skills in multiple choice questions. So anything that you're doing to measure the learning within the training, you can measure some success there. Then it is, are they able to use it on the job? Sometimes the measure of effectiveness for software training is how many support calls did you end up getting afterwards? Are you able to reduce the support calls? Are you able to reduce how much confusion there is on a specific thing? Are you able to increase how much people are using self help resources for software? I would count that's a success in software training. Again, like the example I gave where it was we needed to teach people how to go find the regulations and figure out if their stuff met them. Is there an increase in the use of the resources? Is absolutely a success. And so I think that that's all. I think there's the performance as you're doing the learning, whatever practice exercises and looking at the scores, but also looking at what are the measures of this? Are the people actually using the software? Are they able to get it done? Are they able to complete tasks maybe more efficiently if you've got that sort of measure? Any of that can be the measures of effectiveness. And that would be the same if it's scenario based learning or simulations, or if you were doing stand up classroom training. I think that those measures would be very similar in the assessment.
Definitely. When you talk about emotional and cognitive impact, do you have any metrics to measure that? And in the scenario based learning setup, and do you think that emotional engagement of a learner is as important as the technical skill acquisition? And why do you feel so? Why is it that both the skills need to come in one place?
So I've talked before about that when we talk about engagement, there is behavioral engagement that is the just clicking
Mhm.
things. And that we measure a lot of. But the cognitive engagement, which is how deeply you're thinking about things, and the emotional engagement of having the emotions to feel things and also perceived task value, just how important something is or your perception of that. That can also get into a bit of self-efficacy, your confidence in your belief in your ability to complete something. Those are trickier to measure. In some respects, the cognitive piece of it may be, are people selecting the right tools? Are people doing the right things? And again, we're back to the other measures of performance. I think there's also some interesting questions for learner surveys. Will Tallheimer has a book. I don't know if you are familiar with this. We'll stop and do a little commercial for his book. Performance for learner surveys. This book has a lot of good survey questions, and he talks about thinking about your goals. And so, with emotional engagement, if we're thinking about motivation, he has a sample question in here about how high of a priority will you make this when you get back to your job? Like, how important is this for you to use once you get back on the job? This is a priority, but not a high priority. This is the highest priority because I know my manager support it. This is, I will make this priority, but it's a low priority. I will not make this a priority at all. That is somewhat getting to that motivation and emotional engagement piece of it. Because we've definitely all taken some training and thought, cool, not actually what I'm going to do when I get back to my job. And there's that piece of it. He's got an interesting sample question in here too about people's alignment with principles and if you agree with the principles and thing of that were taught, which is an interesting way to approach the emotional engagement. I think there's also a question about it's tricky to measure self-confidence because self-reported confidence does not necessarily correlate to whether or not people are good at the skill. But he does have a sample question in the book about if you have I'm confident being able to apply this on the job because I practiced doing it in a simulated environment. I'm confident in my ability to do this on the job because I had decision making practice through scenarios. I am confident because I have done this repeatedly and we spaced out the practice over several weeks. You can drill down a little bit about why people are confident and potentially get a little bit more accurate data. I think it's definitely trickier to get the emotional. I think you are relying on learner self-reports to a large extent, and so that I think that just is a limitation. But
Uh-huh.
you definitely can ask better questions, and I love that I Will's book is one of the ones I end up pulling out every time I do surveys because I go look at his sample questions and tweak them a bit to get better things depending on what I'm looking at for which goals.
Definitely. In fact, I believe cognitive ability is a difficult way to measure what the user is actually thinking. And we can't put in a number or a rank there. And thank you so much for sharing that insight and giving the suggestion of the book as well. I'm sure our listeners would take in reference and go find solutions to their problems in that book. Christy, looking ahead, do you see a future where AI personalizes scenario based learning? Because AI is the buzzword. And do you feel that AI would take up and personalize scenario based learning in the real time? And what might that evolution look like? And how could it transform software training as we know it? Correct.
So I think there are probably short-term and long-term effects for AI. And we should always keep in mind when we're looking at AI trends and people are talking about things, the tendency is for people to overestimate the impact in the short term and underestimate the impact in the long term. So you should always keep that lens in mind when you're looking at the hype about AI. I think AI is great and I think it is useful in many ways. I think in terms of scenarios, I think we are starting to get some of that. I have certainly experimented. I do see some people doing chat based scenarios and doing practice with guardrails. I think those are still mostly a novelty. I think they're not quite there for most organizations for most skills. I think that large language models, the LLMs like ChatGPT and Gemini and Copilot, do inherently hallucinate. So it is part of how they're built, and it's not possible to really eliminate that completely. So you end up with things like the Air Canada case where they used a chatbot for support, and someone had asked a question, got a plausible but wrong answer, followed what the chatbot did, and it was wrong. And then the airline, I do think it was Air Canada, and hopefully I'm not misspeaking, had ended up losing a lawsuit later because they said, "Oh, that was our chatbot. That wasn't us providing that support. You're responsible for that. We don't owe you a refund for having given you bad advice." I think that the organizational change for accepting responsibility is not there for AI things. Not that humans don't make mistakes, right? A human can give bad advice in a support chat. I think the cultural change is not quite there yet for a lot of these things. I think we will get there more, but I think it's gonna be a lot slower than what a lot of the hype imp I do see some promising things. I'm not sure quite as much for software training just yet, but I do see some things where using voice for scenarios is definitely much closer to the real skill that you're doing. If you're trying to practice customer service skills, it is much more realistic to use your voice as the response. And if you can have an AI listen to the voice, parse the response, and then say, okay, you mostly said the answer that goes with A, so I'm going to put you on this branch with some more guardrails on it. I think we're going to see some of that initially, and that will feel less risky to organizations initially. Eventually, I do think we will get more of the more open-ended chats. We certainly already have some of these in language training and in other things.
Okay.
I've even seen claims that saw somebody had the claim that really the software as a service whole industry is going to go down because AI will be able to develop software training. You'll just ramp it up and build your own customized software. If I have real skepticism about the timeline that was expressed in the post that I read, I think where they were like, "Oh, this is going to be in the next year or two," and I'm like, "No, people aren't going to be that. We're not going to have that culture shift. is not happening in the next 2 years. But I think longer term, will there be people who are interested in building customized software for themselves with AI? Yes. Which means then part of the training is in training people, how do you do that? How do you prompt for that? I would bet that there will be some interim step of you have most of a software program built as the base, but you have some ability with AI to customize it. And again, then the training is going to be in how do you do that customization? How do you troubleshoot it? That's going to be a completely different world for technical support when you don't have a stable code base and you have AI generating your code base on the fly. I don't know what technical support then ends up looking. AI is going to have to help with the technical support for part of it too, but that's going to be a very different kind of world if that's where we're headed with AI and software. And I think that will happen in some cases. I think that's going to be a much longer change because there's a lot of cultural shifts and logistical shifts that have to happen in order for that to happen. It's again the in the short term, I don't think that major like software as a service, the industry is not going to be gone 2 years from now. That's too big of a change to happen in that short of a time. 20 years from now, I think it will look different. I think if we look 30 years on, AI is going to have the kind of impact on our lives and work that having the internet and having the personal computer have had. And AI will be integrated in so many things in at least little ways in the way that the internet is integrated in so much of our lives now.
Definitely. I think it was Satya Nadella's podcast that you were referring to, where he spoke about the SaaS industry. And it's pretty important to understand that everything has its own pros and cons, whether it's AI. And it's pretty important to also understand the long term and short term perspectives, as you mentioned, in terms of where we are headed in the future. And that's pretty important to keep in account as well. Thank you so much, Christy. This has been such an enlightening conversation. Your insights on scenario based learning and how it transforms the software training truly resonated with us, and I'm sure it will resonate with the audience as well. It's clear that creating engaging, decision driven, and learning experiences isn't just an instructional design, which is ideal, but an achievable goal that can make a real difference in the workplace as well. And thank you so much for sharing your experiences and wisdom. It's been a fantastic way to keep the season 5 moving forward with purpose and depth.
Thank you so much for having me. These were great questions to talk about.
Lovely, lovely hearing you, Christy, and looking forward to more such an insightful conversation. And to all our listeners, make sure you're subscribed to the Digital Adoption Show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and leave us a review. Your support helps us bring in more inspiring and insightful conversations your way. I'm your host, Sanskriti, signing off. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and embrace the future of digital adoption. Thank you.